Hey, y'all, if there is one thing I cannot stand, it is tossing and turning at night because I'm hot and I'm uncomfortable. But all that ended when I was introduced to Cozy Earth. Crafted from 100% bamboo, these sheets are not only incredibly soft, but also they're breathable, they're moisture wicking, and they keep me cool and comfortable all night long. I literally sink into the bed and feel like I am sleeping on a cloud. They have everything from sheet sets to complete bedding bundles to comforters, everything you're going to need to get a night's sleep. And the brand has been featured on Good Morning America, In Style, Better Homes and Gardens. And guess what? They don't stop with bedding either. They got pajamas for both men and women. And I am telling you, they are the most comfortable pajama sets I have ever worn. They have bath towels, robes, tops, hoodies. If you wear it, sleep on it, or dry off with it, they got it. With free shipping on orders over $50, a 100-night sleep trial, and a 10-year warranty, Cozy Earth will bring you what it brought me: a good night's sleep and a whole lot of comfort. Exposed Podcast has partnered with Cozy Earth to offer my listeners 41% off by using the code EXPOSED at checkout. That's 41% off by going to CozyEarth.com and using the code EXPOSED at checkout. Sleep better, live better, choose Cozy Earth. Sweet dreams await. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Exposed, Scandalous Files of the Elite. I'm your host, Jim Chapman, and I am back with part 8 of this bad boy series covering Aaron Hernandez. Now, before I get into it, I got a shout out of my newest global celebrity member, Miss Angela Goff. Now, Miss Goff is from the great state of Texas. Cleveland, Texas, to be specific. And fun fact about Cleveland, this community was formed in 1878 when Charles Cleveland, who the city is named after, decided 63.6 acres of land. He wanted to donate that to the railroads. Now, he had an agreement that a railway station would bear his name, which it did. And oddly enough, I'm sure at the time he didn't realize the entire city would be named after him. Now, the city is near the much larger city of Houston, Texas. And I want to thank you so much, Miss Angela Goff, for joining the global celebrity tier on Patreon. Now, if any listeners would like to find out what all the fun is about, check us out, patreon.com/exposed podcast files. So let's get into today's episode. And the last time that I left you, Mr. Bradley had completed his testimony, and y'all were thinking the same thing I was, that he did a good job of articulating his experience with Aaron Hernandez and how Aaron Hernandez likely was guilty of everything that Alexander Bradley was saying. He also appeared to rattle the defense attorney and frustrate him because he could just not intimidate Alexander Bradley. So I was pretty convinced, and it sounds like you were too, that Aaron Hernandez was going to be found guilty. So what happened? And I'm not going to cover everyone else that testified because Bradley's testimony was really the most damning. But overall, and I listened to all of them, I felt the prosecution proved this case beyond a reasonable doubt, which is their burden. So the prosecutor, the defense, they rest their cases, and the case is turned over to the jury. And after 32 hours of deliberations, the jury comes back with verdicts of not guilty of the first-degree murders of Furtado and De Abreu. The only thing that Aaron Hernandez was found guilty of was unlawful possession of a firearm, and that's pretty much a slap on the wrist. And I've got to be honest, that shocked me. It just appeared the jury did not find Alexander Bradley credible. They felt like he was testifying as part of a deal that he made with prosecutors so he wouldn't do all this time in prison, I'm assuming. So regardless of all of that, on April 14th of 2017, Hernandez, fresh off this victory, if you will, was still headed back to prison because he's already got a life sentence for the murder of Odin Lloyd. Now, just 5 days later, this happened. And I'm going to reference the actual passage in the book that I used, not primarily, but heavily in my researching of this story. And it's called All American Murder. It's by James Patterson and Mike Harkey. And that passage reads, "The phones in General Housing Unit all look the same. Mounted on columns, they were silver-colored with black handsets. To use them, prisoners punched in PIN numbers that had to be assigned to them upon arrival. But prison etiquette had to be followed. By general understanding, each phone was claimed by a different gang. The Latin Kings had their own phones. The gangs from Boston and Springfield had their phones. Aaron Hernandez used phones that were claimed by the Bloods. In the days immediately following his exoneration for the double murders in Boston, he spoke with his lawyers and with family members. He'd stay on the line with his fiancée, Cheyenne, until the last possible minute. Then, as 9:30 neared, a correction officer would call time. 5 minutes to count, the CO would shout. Every night was the same. The inmates in G2 would shuffle off, grudgingly, to their cells. Hernandez would climb a set of blue stairs to his cell, cell number 57, left of the correction officer's desk, located one level below. The CO would flip a switch that caused all the doors in the unit to slam shut and lock for the night. Then the prisoners would stand facing a window in their cell door, and the CO would walk slowly past each cell, eyeballing the prisoners and physically checking to make sure each door was locked. Some COs walked the ground floor first, then climbed the stairs to count the seconds. Some COs did the opposite. It was as much variety as the system allowed for. For Aaron Hernandez, this had been the routine for 2 years, but the past few days had been different. According to an internal prison report, quote, he was positive and even happily emotional, which was not usual of Hernandez. Aaron told other inmates that he was looking forward to reuniting with his family and with Cheyenne. He was still young, 27. If Jose Baez could work his magic again, he may have had a few years of football left in him. Since Friday's verdict, he had been talking about the NFL and going back to play, even if it wasn't for the Pats, an inmate would say. He talked about his daughter and spending time with her. Now, it was the evening of April 18th of 2017. The Patriots, who had won the Super Bowl again that year, would be going to the White House the next morning to meet with President Trump. But once again, Aaron stayed on the line with Cheyenne, drawing out the last long minutes of the day. Then the CO called time and Hernandez shuffled off to his cell, his dark brown eyes shining with a purpose. A few hours later, at around 1 a.m, Aaron hung part of a bed sheet over his window, cut into the door of his cell. He jammed the rail the door ran on with ripped up pieces of cardboard. Then he opened his Bible to the book of John and wrote John 3:16 in red ink across his forehead. Slicing into his right middle finger, Aaron used his own blood to mark the same passage in the Bible. He wrote John 3:16 in his own blood on the wall of his cell and drew a crude pyramid like the one on the back of a $1 bill. Beneath it, he wrote the word Illuminati. Leaving several handwritten notes by the side of the Bible, he made large stigmata-like marks in blood on both of his feet. Then, stripped naked, he poured several bottles of shampoo from the prison canteen all over the floor and picked up another part of the bedsheet, which he had twisted tightly into a rope. Hernandez tied one end of the twisted sheet to the top of one of the vertical slats in the window across from the door to his cell. But the crossbar was just 5 feet from the floor. There was a metal desk directly beneath it, a metal chair next to it. Both had been bolted right into the wall. What happened next took doing and determination on Aaron's part. First, he rolled up some towels and stuck them through the crossbars so that the twisted sheet wouldn't slide down the vertical slat. Then, he tied the other end of the sheet around his neck. By the time the guards found him, Aaron Hernandez was cold to the touch. And folks, it was on that night that obviously he committed suicide. So I'm also going to read various reports. One from the state police covering the investigation into the suicide, and also one summarizing inmate interviews. So the state police, they investigated this, and this is how it reads. On Wednesday, April 19th, 2017, at approximately 4:15 in the morning, the undersigned, which is the state policeman that created this report, was advised that the Massachusetts Department of Corrections reported the unattended death of a 27-year-old Hispanic male, Aaron Hernandez, in cell 57 of the General Housing Unit, G2. The undersigned responded along with Lieutenant Daniel Wildgrub and Corporal Kristen Glanton. Upon arrival, the undersigned spoke with Sergeant Todd Smith of the Massachusetts Department of Corrections Office of Investigative Services. Sergeant Smith advised that around 3:03 in the morning, a code 99 was called by Corrections Officer Guard Gerard Bro, reporting Hernandez was hanging in cell number 57. Once other correction officers arrived on the scene, the correction officers discovered the door was pegged, which meant cardboard had been shoved into the door tracks to prevent the door from opening. The corrections officers had to manually open the door to enter the cell. As they entered the cell, the COs discovered that Hernandez had placed a large amount of shampoo on the floor, which made it very slippery. The corrections officers were able to cut Hernandez down, who was hanging naked from a bed sheet tied around the window bars. As the corrections officers began CPR, medical staff arrived on the scene and attached an AED, which advised no shock. CPR was continued as Hernandez was transported to the UMass Health Alliance Hospital by ambulance. Upon arrival at the hospital, Hernandez was treated by Dr. Evan Swayze. Hernandez never regained consciousness and was declared dead at 4:07 a.m. by Dr. Swayze. As the undersigned entered the treatment room in the emergency room of the UMass Health Hospital at approximately 5:21 a.m., the undersigned observed Corrections Officer Hilton and Corrections Officer Aziz standing by a gurney covered with a sheet. The undersigned removed the sheet and observed Hernandez with cervical collar brace. Ligature marks were visible on Hernandez's neck, and there was some discharge/vomit from his nose and mouth areas. Hernandez's right middle finger had a fresh cut, and there was some blood on the adjacent fingers. There also appeared to be a large circular blood mark on each of Hernandez's feet, and John 3:16 was written on Hernandez's forehead in ink. There were no signs of trauma or violence on Hernandez's body. Hemorrhaging was present in both eyes. Lividity was present, and rigor mortis was beginning to set in. And lividity, folks, for those of you that may not know, that's when you get pooling of blood. So especially in a situation where you're hanging, the blood all drains down and it pools in spots of your body. And that's what he's referencing there. Glanton also photographed and documented Hernandez's body. Representatives of the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner arrived on the scene and took custody of Hernandez's body at approximately 6:30 a.m. Hernandez's body was then transported to an office in Boston. Lieutenant Wilgrub, Glanton, and the undersigned responded to the Correctional Center on April 19th of 2017, and Sergeant Smith advised the undersigned that Hernandez had been locked in his single inmate cell around 1959 hours. Hernandez remained in the cell until 3:03 a.m. when Hernandez was discovered hanging. Sergeant Smith and Sergeant Rumry, the Interior Perimeter Security Commander, advised the undersigned that there was video surveillance of the G2 cell block from the time Hernandez entered the cell until the time he was transported by ambulance. According to Sergeant Rumry, no one entered the cell until the COs entered it to render aid. The undersigned observed the cardboard stuffed into the door tracks leading into the cell. On the wall of the cell, there were several drawings, and John 3:16 was written in a substance consistent with blood. Under the drawings was a Bible open to John 3:16 with the 16th verse marked in blood, and next to the Bible were 3 handwritten notes. Under the bed was a piece of the bed sheet that had been cut and that had been around Hernandez's neck. Tied on the bars of the window was the other piece of the bed sheet. Lieutenant Wilgrub cut the sheet from the window and placed it into evidence. There were no signs of a struggle in the cell, and another officer photographed and documented the scenes. Lieutenant Wilgrub and the undersigned spoke with CO Bro on April 19th of 2017. He advised that he was working 2300 to 0700 shift and was assigned to the G2 housing unit. Correction Officer Bro last saw Hernandez around 1 o'clock a.m. during the 1 o'clock check, and according to him, at 3:03 a.m., he observed a sheet hanging in front of Hernandez's cell door. CO Bro asked Hernandez to remove the sheet or sound off. As CO Bro poked a piece of the sheet that was hanging outside of the door, the sheet fell and he observed Hernandez hanging naked from the window. CO Bro immediately called a code 99, and once the door opened, Correction Officer Bro and several other COs attempted to lift Hernandez to relieve pressure. As Hernandez was cut down, Correction Officer Bro began performing chest compressions and swapped out with other COs until Hernandez was removed from the unit. Sergeant Rumry and Sergeant Smith provided the undersigned with copies of video surveillance, logs, and reports in reference to Hernandez's death. All other items seemed to have no evidentiary value and were left in the custody of the Department of Corrections. Over the course of the investigation, the undersigned reviewed surveillance evidence of the G2 housing unit, phone logs, and calls from Hernandez on April 18th and 19th of 2017. The surveillance video showed Hernandez was on the phone just prior to being locked in his cell. Hernandez entered his cell alone at approximately 1959 hours, and the cell door is locked until 3:07 a.m. when the doors open for the code 99. The undersigned also listened to the last 5 phone calls Hernandez made on April 18th of 2017. Hernandez does not make any apparent indication of the intent to harm himself during any of those calls. On Wednesday, April 19th, 2017, Dr. Henry Niels performed an autopsy of Hernandez. Dr. Niels determined the cause of death to be asphyxia by hanging. The manner of death was ruled by Dr. Niels as a suicide. A post-mortem toxicology report indicated that Hernandez's blood came back negative for all substances tested, to include synthetic cannabis. On April 24th, 2017, the undersigned responded to the Department of Corrections Office of Investigations. The undersigned took copies of a letter found in Hernandez's property, as well as copies of several unknown writing samples of Hernandez. On April 24th of 2017, at approximately 1400 hours, the undersigned delivered copies of the letters found in Hernandez's cell to the Department of Corrections. Based upon the findings of the chief medical examiner and the investigation by the undersigned respectively requests the case be closed until new information is uncovered that will warrant the case being opened. So there you have that.
Jim, did you see what happened in Texas today?
Wait, before you tell me that, let me tell you what happened in New York.
It cannot be as crazy as the case I told you about yesterday in Louisiana.
You know what? We should do a podcast about it.
And with that, we did. Crime Wire Weekly covers the crime news headlines that have dominated the week.
We cover trending crimes from all over the country and even sprinkle in a few globally.
Crime Wire Weekly is available now wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Simply by searching Crime Wire Weekly or clicking the link in the description of this podcast. And I'm going to cover what's known as an inmate interview summary. And it basically says the summaries of the unit interviews conducted by the inner perimeter security officers are as followed. Out of the inmates that were interviewed, many inmates claimed to have no or very little interaction with Hernandez. Those inmates stated Hernandez was a private inmate who was approachable, but felt it was their business to get involved with him, and they would rather keep to themselves. Few inmates brought up what was being said on the news and on the radio stations they had been listening to. One inmate stated specifically that the 98.5 radio broadcast had been disrespectful, saying he deserved what he got, and had also mentioned that they had brought up the fact Hernandez may be gay. Multiple inmates stated they had interactions with Hernandez on a daily basis, but it was more of a respectful relationship with only hi and bye type conversations in passing. Many inmates stated that they had congratulated Hernandez on his recent court decision. Inmates that had more frequent interactions with Hernandez stated he showed no signs of any trouble or depression and stated he carried on as normal. They stated Hernandez had made multiple phone calls, including a phone call to his fiancée and daughter, and with positive feelings. No inmate stated he had any trouble within the unit or spoke of any other known problems. Inmates that had stated they were close with Hernandez stated that he was very excited over the weekend after his verdict had come down on Friday. They stated he was positive and even happily emotional, which was not usual of Hernandez, they said. One of these inmates said that they had played basketball recently with Hernandez and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A couple of inmates stated that he had come to their door before lock-in and described the conversation as nothing out of the ordinary. Of the inmates that said they were, quote, tight or real close with Hernandez, they stated he had been more spiritual as time progressed in prison. They felt that his suicide had been some sort of religious message. One inmate stated that he did Hernandez's laundry and Hernandez had requested his laundry been ready for the weekend because he was expecting a visit from his fiancée and his daughter. He stated nothing was wrong with Hernandez and he didn't seem upset. Another inmate stated that Hernandez had talked to him more and more frequently with a religious tone. This inmate stated that Hernandez came to his door before lock-in and stated, quote, remember, when you die, your soul gets reincarnated. Another source stated that Hernandez had recently mentioned a rumor. This rumor was that if an inmate had an open appeal on his case and died in prison, he is acquitted of his charge and will be deemed not guilty. A source who claimed to be one of Hernandez's closest friends stated, quote, spoke with him yesterday and he was in a great place. He was a very spiritual guy who was always quoting the Bible. Since Friday's verdict, he had been talking about the NFL and going back to play even if it wasn't with the Pats. He talked about his daughter and spending time with her. There was absolutely no indication that he would do anything like that. And one of the last inmates interviewed stated, quote, what do you do when you get good news? You celebrate, right? And that's how that report read. Okay, so we left a suicide note to Shay. I'm going to read that to you quickly. It's really just a little over a paragraph. It says, Shay, you have always been my soulmate, and I want you to live life and know I'm always with you. I told you what was coming indirectly. I love you so much and know you are an angel. We split into two to come change the world. Your characteristics is that you are a true angel and the definition of God's love. Tell my story fully, but never think anything besides how much I love you. This was the Supreme's, the Almighty's plan, not mine. I love you. And it redacted his daughter's name, know how much I love her. Look after redacted and redacted for me. They are my boys. And then he put in parentheses, you're rich. I Knew I Loved You equals Savage Garden. And there you have it. Strange, not easy to follow, but that is the suicide note that he left for Shay. So this story would be far from over with Aaron Hernandez's death, when in May of 2017, an obscure law, the one that was referenced by that inmate, it wasn't referenced by the law's name, which is actually known as the abatement principle, but that obscure law paved the way for Aaron Hernandez's conviction to be overturned in the murder of Odin Lloyd. So I'm going to reference the following article from ESPN. And this is May 9th of 2017. A judge erased a 2013 murder conviction against former NFL star Aaron Hernandez, ruling the case law in Massachusetts has long been established that defendants who die before their appeals are heard should have their convictions vacated. Bristol County Superior Court Judge E. Susan Garsh said Tuesday she was compelled to follow precedent in ordering that Hernandez's first-degree murder conviction be dismissed in the death of the semi-professional player Odin Lloyd. Hernandez killed himself in prison last month while serving a life sentence. Lloyd's mother fought back tears after the ruling Tuesday, saying the former New England Patriots tight end would always be guilty in the eyes of her family. Quote, "In our book, he's guilty, and he's always going to be guilty," Ursula Ward said of Hernandez. "But I know one day I'm going to see my son, and that's the victory I have, and I'm going to take that with me. I'm waiting for my master to say, 'Well done, my good and faithful servant, and welcome to the joys of my kingdom,' and that's when I will see my baby again. I'm not giving up when God says the battle's over, so I'm holding on until he tells me to give up." And that freaking infuriates me that this was overturned, because it's so disrespectful to the family. It's just disgusting. I can't believe that happened, but we'll move on. Bristol County DA Thomas Quinn said he plans to appeal the ruling and is willing to take the case all the way to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Despite the tragic ending to Aaron Hernandez's life, he should not reap the legal benefits of an antiquated rule, Quinn said. State and federal courts from across the country have rejected this antiquated rule. Massachusetts, in my opinion, needs to follow suit. Lawyers for Hernandez had argued the Supreme Judicial Court had applied the legal doctrine without exception, even in cases of suicide. They said his conviction wasn't considered final because the automatic appeal he was entitled to had not been heard. Prosecutor Patrick Boomberg said Hernandez's suicide was a calculated act. He cited a report issued last week from the DOC that said Hernandez told another inmate he had a rumor that if the inmate has an open appeal on a case and dies in prison, he would be acquitted. Garsh said there may be many complex and milder reasons that Hernandez killed himself. She cited a report from prison officials that some inmates said they knew about a radio broadcast that speculated Hernandez may have been gay. She also said a possible mental disturbance was reflected in the suicide note to his fiancée, in which he said his death was, quote, "the Supreme's, the Almighty's plan, not mine." Lloyd's mother had filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Hernandez. Her attorney, Douglas Sheff, said he doesn't believe the civil case would be undermined by the dismissal of Hernandez's conviction. An attorney in Hernandez's criminal case filed court papers last month that said his estate is currently worth $0. Sheff said the only identifiable assets he knows of are Hernandez's house, valued at $1.3 million, and a Hummer. But he noted that a message Hernandez left for his fiancée said in part, "You're rich." And he said, "We don't know what that refers to. We'd like to find out." Hernandez appeal attorney John Thompson told reporters he believes it's still uncertain as to whether Hernandez took his own life. Thompson said he has recent correspondence from Hernandez in which he said he was interested in pursuing an appeal. Hernandez's lead attorney in his recent double murder trial, Jose Boz, had pledged to independently investigate the death. State police said in an investigative report, and I'm not going to go through that because I just did, his death came 5 days after he was acquitted, and then it kind of goes through what he did. So at this point, just disgusting, sickening stuff, in my opinion. Now, there's another thing the public discovered during this time, and that is that Boston University had been studying Aaron's brain since his death to see if he suffered from CTE. But before we get into the results of that, let me cover what CTE is. Now, it stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And it's a miracle that I just pronounced that right. I'm only going to try it once. It's a progressive disease that degenerates the brain. It's found in individuals with history of repetitive head trauma. It's characterized by the buildup of an abnormal protein. This is called tau, T-A-U, in the brain, which can lead to cognitive, emotional, and behavioral problems. CTE is primarily diagnosed after death through a brain autopsy, but suspicion can arise from symptoms and a history of repeated head impacts. Key features of CTE: it's very progressive and it worsens over time. It degenerates. It involves a gradual breakdown and loss of brain cells, and it's caused by repetitive head trauma, like when you're playing football. Protein buildup is kind of the hallmark of CTE. That TAU, that tau protein in the brain, that's what causes the normal brain function to be disrupted. And what are some symptoms? Well, a lot of it's cognitive, memory loss, confusion, difficulty concentrating, impaired judgment. There's a lot of behavior changes that are associated. Aggression, being very impulsive, being very irritable, depressed, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, all of that. And you'll notice mood instability. One point you're happy, one point you're sad, and it's just back and forth all the time. And who's at risk? Athletes. Soccer, boxing, hockey, football, the UFC, things like that. Also, military personnel, veterans who have been in combat, for example, and got a head injury, very at risk. And really anyone else that gets multiple head injuries, like from accidents, if you get in several car accidents and you get knocked out in these accidents, that can bring on CTE. And they're learning more about this as they go along in society. The problem with CTE is a lot of times it's not diagnosed until you die, and then they look at your brain and they discover all this protein buildup in there. Now, not everyone with head injuries will develop CTE. It's a high-risk factor, obviously, but there's been a lot of people that have had major head collisions from football, etc., that don't develop CTE. They don't really have an exact number of people that have actually had CTE because they have to be able to look at your brain to do that. A lot of people don't allow that to happen after someone dies, and there's no cure for CTE. You can treat it a little bit and manage the symptoms, but there is no cure once it occurs. So now that you know what CTE is, let's get into the results as it relates to Aaron Hernandez. And I'm going to reference an article put out by Boston University. This was on September 21st of 2017, and it reads as follows. Aaron Hernandez, a former New England Patriot and convicted murderer who died from suicide in jail in April, suffered from chronic traumatic, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it again, suffered from CTE to a degree never seen before by researchers at Boston University in such a young person. Hernandez, just 27, when he hanged himself with a bedsheet, was riddled with what's known as stage 3 CTE to a degree that, quote, we've never seen in our 468 brains, except for in individuals very much older. That from Ann McKee, director of Boston University's Chronic Traumatic, I'm not going to try to say it again, Center. She went on to say individuals with similar gross findings were at least 46 years old at the time of death. CTE, which has 4 stages, is progressive and it's found in athletes and others who suffer repeated concussions and other brain trauma. It's associated with dementia, mood changes, and aggression. Quote, especially in the frontal lobes, which are very important for decision-making, judgment, and cognitive skills. We could see damage to the inner chambers of the brain, McKee said as she screened through slides showing sections of Hernandez's brain. This would be the first case we've ever seen of that kind of damage in such a young individual. She said in addition to deposits of the protein tau, which is associated with CTE, other evidence of the disease ranged across Hernandez's brain. That included diluted ventricles, the chambers storing spinal fluid, which indicate the brain had shrunk, and an atrophied fornix, which are the nerves associated with memory. All of these caused by repetitive brain trauma. Noting that Hernandez did not suffer from other brain diseases, such as Alzheimer's, McKee said that in every place that we looked, it was classic CTE. This is substantial damage that undoubtedly took years to develop. McKee is a School of Medicine professor of neurology and pathology and had disclosed in September that Hernandez had suffered from CTE. Her center has done pioneering research on the illness through its bank of donated brains, including Hernandez. She briefed reporters on details of her examination during their second annual CTE conference, and she said this brain had been one of the most significant contributions to her work because of Hernandez's youth and the organ's pristine condition when it was turned over by the medical examiner. The integrity of the brain tissue is so well preserved that we're advancing our understanding of the disease at a sub-microscopic level. We're able to do things in this particular brain that we can't always do given the condition of the brain when we receive it. She went on to say helmets do not protect athletes from the jarring head movements associated with CTE. It's an intrinsic component of football. Every time you have a tackle or a collision, you're going to have these rapid forces affecting the brain. That's one of the most difficult things to keep football safe. Hernandez CTE prompted the player's estate to sue the National Football League and the Patriots, and I'm going to get into that in a second. But she went on to say, while I'm not going to connect the dots with his behavior or difficulties during life, the frontal lobes, and his were very severely affected, were involved in problem solving, judgment, impulse control, and social behavior. There were also parts of Aaron Hernandez's brain that were involved in emotional regulation and emotional behavior, fear, and anxiety that were affected. She also said that while Hernandez had genetic markers that make people vulnerable to brain disease, it wasn't certain that it contributed to his condition. So, look, all that's horrible, but he didn't get a pass in my mind, regardless of that. But take with that what you will. Now, something positive in this case finally occurred on March 13th of 2019 when the AP released this article that I'm going to reference, reversing that abatement principle as it relates to the initial conviction of Aaron Hernandez. So let me read you that. Aaron Hernandez's murder conviction was reinstated in a sweeping ruling in the Massachusetts highest court that does away with the legal principle that made the former NFL star innocent in the eyes of the law after he killed himself in prison. The Supreme Court unanimously found that the legal rule that erased Hernandez's conviction is outdated and no longer consistent with the circumstances of contemporary life. It ordered Hernandez's conviction be restored and the practice be abolished for future cases. The ruling does not affect past cases. Then it goes into Hernandez and what he did. I'm not going to cover all that, but it says, under the doctrine rooted in centuries of English law, a conviction should not be considered until the final appeal can determine whether mistakes were made that deprived the defendant of a fair trial. How states handle cases such as Hernandez vary widely. Some, like Massachusetts, toss the convictions, while other states dismiss the defendant's appeal and the conviction stands, which in my opinion is how it should be. Others allow appeal courts to consider the dead defendant's case. The DA, whose office prosecuted Hernandez's case, applauded the court's decision, saying they are pleased that justice is served in the case, the antiquated practice of vacating a valid conviction is being eliminated, and the victim's family can get closure that they deserve. The decision has helped the family to obtain closure from a horrible loss of their beloved son, Odin. And it also said other high-profile Massachusetts criminals whose convictions have been erased after their deaths include John Salvi, who was convicted of killing 2 abortion clinic workers and wounding 5 other people during a shooting in 1994, and Roman Catholic priest John Geoghegan, a key figure in the clergy sex abuse scandal that rocked the Boston Archdiocese and spread across the globe, also had his child molestation conviction vacated after he was beaten to death in 2003 in his cell, the same maximum security prison where Hernandez died. A victory there, as Odin Lloyd's family, they may never get closure, because you don't get closure in these things, but at least they got some justice there. All right, so in that most recent article that I just covered, I told you about the NFL getting sued by the family of Aaron Hernandez over CTE. And when I say the family, his fiance, Shay, and his child, who was also listed in this suit against the New England Patriots and the NFL. And I'm going to go over that with you quickly, give you facts of that case. And it says the National Football League is the most successful professional sports organization in the U.S. In 2016 alone, the NFL generated approximately $13 billion with a B dollars in revenue. A substantial portion of this revenue comes from sponsorships, licensing, and the sale of national broadcasting rights to football games. Professional football teams that compete in the league, such as the Patriots, share a percentage of the league's overall revenue. Since its formation in August of 1920, the American Professional Football Association renamed the NFL in 1922. The NFL had promoted the game of football, acting as a governing body and establishing rules related to player health, safety, league policies, and ownership. The NFL actively monitors player conduct, health, and safety. And in addition, the NFL consults with medical professionals regarding the risk to players' health associated to playing football. The NFL has autonomous power to establish rules and policies, and at all relevant times exercised its power to set rules and policy for the health and safety of football players. Then it goes on to say the NFL was well aware of the long-term risks of head impacts. For decades, the medical and scientific community has been aware of the link between repetitive jarring and injury to the head and increased risks of neurocognitive damage. Since the early 1990s, the medical and scientific community has indicated, through overwhelming consensus, that many football players develop brain injuries from subconcussive injuries and concussions. Independent scientists and neurologists recognize the concussions were serious injuries and result in permanent brain injury, impaired abilities, and increased onset of mental deterioration. The NFL had been aware since 1994 that on-field collisions led to latent head injuries that have long-term debilitating effects on players. For decades, the NFL has been aware the multiple blows to the head can lead to long-term brain injury, including but not limited to memory loss, dementia, depression, and CTE. The NFL also acknowledged the debilitating effects of head trauma in its court filings. In 1999, Mike Webster, who had played professional football for the Pittsburgh Steelers between 1974 and 1990, filed a request for complete disability benefits with the NFL based on neuro damage he sustained over the course of his career. An NFL physician examined Webster independently and concluded Webster was, in fact, mentally disabled as a result of head impacts he sustained while playing in the NFL. In December 2006, the Fourth Circuit of the United States Court of Appeals stated in an unpublished opinion that the NFL's disability plan accepted that Webster's mental disability was caused by the multiple head injuries Webster sustained while playing pro football. Although the NFL was aware of the link between subconcussive and concussive injury sustained in football and chronic neuro injury to players, the NFL hid or otherwise failed to provide this information to NFL players. The failure has been well documented in the news media, in the scientific and medical community during Congress, and in prior litigation. The NFL's Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee was formed in 1994 to improve player safety and recommend rule changes aimed at reducing head injuries. The committee set out to study the effects of concussions to NFL players. However, the NFL used the committee to coerce and manipulate the scientific and medical community in an effort to avoid potential liability in rule changes that might affect the commercial success of pro football. For years, they utilized biased, industry-friendly, and false information related to concussive injuries, etc. Despite the NFL publicizing the committee's doctors and researchers were independent, the committee consisted of at least 5 people previously connected to the NFL. And that's significant. Moreover, the NFL failed to appoint any neurologists, head trauma specialists, or neuropathologists to chair the committee. Instead, the commissioner, Paul Tagliabue, appointed Dr. Elliot Pellman, a rheumatologist who had no specialized training or education in concussion or head injuries, and that is very strange. Dr. Pellman was a paid physician and trainer for the New York Jets. Despite his lack of qualifications, he remained the chair of the committee from 1994 until 2007, and during this period, the committee publicly disputed scientific findings that establish a link between concussions and permanent neurological injuries. Dr. Ira Casson, a board-certified neurologist, and Dr. David Viano, a biomedical engineer, were both members of the committee, and they attempted to discredit published scientific studies that linked head impacts and concussions suffered by NFL players to permanent neurocognitive injuries. The committee also conducted and published industry-sponsored, biased, falsified, and inaccurate research to support the NFL's position there was no connection between concussions and permanent neuro injuries. In 1997, the Academy of Neurology published guidelines for athletes returning to play the game after having suffered a concussion. These guidelines recommended that any athlete who suffers a concussion at grade 3, that's where you lose consciousness, should be ineligible to play and should rest until asymptomatic for at least 1 week. After a prolonged grade 3 concussion, they recommended the athlete should be withheld from play for 2 weeks. In 2000, the NFL officially rejected the application of these guidelines to NFL players. Between 2002 and 2007, Dr. Bennett Amalu, an independent researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, examined the brain tissue of deceased NFL players, including Mike Webster, Terry Long, and Andre Waters. These individuals suffered multiple concussions during their NFL careers and later in life exhibited symptoms of deteriorated cognitive functions, paranoia, panic, and depression. The doctor determined these individuals suffered from the neuro disorder CTE. The doctor's findings were published in the Neurosurgery magazine, where he concluded that Webster and Long's respective deaths were partially caused by CTE and were related to multiple concussions. In response to the doctor's articles, Dr. Pellman, Casson, and Viano, members of the committee, wrote a letter to the editor of Neurosurgery magazine demanding that Dr. Amalu's article be retracted. Dr. Amalu's articles were not retracted, and Neurosurgery magazine would later publish additional papers by Dr. Amalu on this topic. Good for them. In October of 2003, the committee published its first paper and suggested there were no long-term negative effects associated with concussions or concussive injuries sustained by NFL players. And that, y'all, is absolute fucking bullshit. And that pisses me off. There is so much proof that that's bullshit. It's unbelievable. How the hell can you say someone can be concussed to the point that they are knocked out and it not produce long-term injuries when it happens over and over and over again to the same person? Unbelievable. In November of 2003, Dr. Pellman appeared on the HBO television program Inside the NFL to discuss a report by the Center for the Study of Retired Athletes that linked concussions and depressions in former players and stated, quote, "When I look at the study, I don't believe it." The committee subsequently published 16 papers between 2003 and 2009. The committee indicated that all of the completed studies supported their conclusion that there were no long-term negative health consequences associated with concussions or injuries concussive in nature sustained by NFL players. In 2004, the committee published a study based on clinical data they collected from physicians and athletic trainers for 6 years and concluded there is no evidence of increased severity of injury in multiple versus single mild traumatic brain injury cases. Their research also concluded that repeated injuries occurred relatively infrequently during the 6-year period. In February of 2005, the committee published findings based on a 6-year study that players who are concussed and return to the same game have fewer initial signs and symptoms than those removed from play. Return to play does not involve a significant risk of a second injury either in the same game or during the season. That is absolutely insane as well. The report continued to say the current decision-making of NFL team physicians seems appropriate for the return to the game after a concussion. Can you believe that? Biased and erroneous conclusions by the committee published include, but are not limited to, the following. Doctors Pellman and Viano stated that because a significant percentage of players returned to play in the same game as they suffered a concussion, and the overwhelming majority of players with concussions were kept out of football-related activities for less than 1 week, it can be concluded that mild TBIs in professional football are not serious injuries. The NFL players did not show a decline in brain function after a concussion. There were no ill effects among those who had 3 or more concussions or took hits to the head that sidelined them for a week or more. No NFL player experienced the second impact syndrome or CTE from repeated concussions. This is just crazy that they would even say this. In 2006, the committee published research concluding that on-field evaluation by team physicians is effective with regard to the identification of cognitive and memory impairments immediately after an injury. And what they're talking about is when these players get knocked out and they run on the field and they hold up, how many fingers am I holding up? They might be holding up 3. And if you say 3, you're good to go. That kind of thing. Throughout this period, the committee was heavily criticized by independent doctors and research because the committee's conclusions were contrary to a multitude of peer-reviewed studies that were based on one-sided data collection techniques. In February 2007, Dr. Pellman stepped down as the chairman of the committee following increasing media scrutiny over the committee's studies. He was replaced as chair by Dr. Ira Cason and Dr. Viano, but remained a member of the committee. Dr. Cason and Viano continued to dismiss outside studies and overwhelming evidence that linked head injuries and concussions suffered by NFL players to permanent neurocognitive injuries. In a 2007 televised interview by Bernard Goldberg on HBO's Real Sports, Dr. Cason unequivocally stated there was no evidence that links multiple head injuries among pro football players with depression, dementia, early onset Alzheimer's, or other permanent neurological disorders. On June 19, 2007, the NFL held its first league-wide concussion summit in Chicago, where all 32 NFL teams' health and safety committees, doctors, and trainers convened. At the summit, Dr. Cason told team doctors and trainers that the only scientifically valid evidence CTE has been found in boxers and jockeys. He added it has never been scientifically valid in any other athletes. On August 14, 2007, the NFL published an informational pamphlet on concussions to NFL players and their families, and it stated current research with professional athletes has not shown that having more than 1 or 2 concussions can lead to permanent problems if each injury is managed properly. It's important to understand there's no magic number for how many concussions is too many. Research is currently underway to determine if there are any long-term effects of concussion in NFL athletes. In 2008, Boston University's Dr. Ann McKee found CTE in the brains of two deceased NFL players, John Grimsley and Tom McHale. Dr. McKee stated the easiest way to decrease the incidence of CTE is to decrease the number of concussions or mild traumatic brain injuries. Dr. McKee further noted that this is accomplished by penalizing intentional hits to the head and adhering to strict return-to-play guidelines. Finally, Dr. McKee concluded that studies indicate the safe return-to-play guidelines might require at least 4 to 6 weeks to facilitate more complete recovery and to protect from re-injury, as a second concussion occurs much more frequently in the immediate period after a concussion. And I would even go further. I played football for over 10 years of my life, and I'm also an avid fan of the UFC. And I'm going to tell you, when someone gets knocked out in the UFC, they become susceptible to knockouts from there on out. Chuck the Iceman Liddell was a knockout artist, and he dominated the UFC about 10 years ago. And then he gets knocked out. He loses his title. And he got knocked out in the next 5 fights he did. Once you turn that button on, you can't turn it off, but I'll continue. Dr. Cason characterized each study as an isolated incident. In response to Dr. McKee's studies responding to the publication, Dr. Cason asserted in a written statement before his appearance at a House Judiciary Committee hearing in January of 2010 that his position was there's not enough valid or reliable scientific evidence at present time to determine whether or not repeated head impacts in professional football result in long-term brain damage. In 2008, the NFL commissioned the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research to conduct phone interviews of a random sample of over 1,000 retired players and ask them questions across a range of topics. And the findings of that study, released on September 10th of 2009, reported that diseases of the mind are rare in both the general population and NFL retirees. But the retirees do report a higher rate at 6%. The older group of retirees is particularly high. After the finding was published, NFL spokesman Greg Aiello stated in an email message the study did not formally diagnose dementia, that it was subject to shortcomings of telephone surveys, and that there are thousands of retired players who do not have memory problems. Dr. Cason then stated, what I take from this report is that there's a need for further studies. Based on these and many other documented incidents, it's clear the NFL was aware of neurological risks associated with repeated head impact and that the NFL failed to disclose this to the players. The conduct also needlessly delayed adoption of rules and league policies related to player health. And it goes on and on with some other studies. I'm not going to cover that, but I will cover what it says directly about Aaron Hernandez. It says Aaron Hernandez developed CTE as a result of playing professional football. Between 2010 and 2013, Aaron Hernandez played football for the Patriots. During his professional football career, Aaron experienced repeated traumatic head impacts, including subconcussive blows and concussions, with a greater frequency and severity than the general population of men of a similar age. The repeated head impacts experienced by Aaron, including the subconcussive blows and concussions, are known to greatly increase the risk of developing CTE. On April 19, 2017, Aaron committed suicide while in custody of the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. Boston University School of Medicine, after his death, examined Aaron Hernandez's brain and neurological matter. On August 17, 2017, the School of Medicine issued a neuropathology report diagnosing Aaron with stage 3 CTE at the time of his death. CTE is a neurological disorder that progresses through 4 worsening stages of brain degeneracy. According to the CTE Society, individuals suffering from CTE in stage 3, like Aaron, typically experience symptoms such as memory loss, executive dysfunction, aggressive, explosive behavior, loss of concentration, mood swings, depression, and cognitive impairment. The Boston University report also notes that Aaron's CTE pathology was unusually severe, considering his young age. So that is the lawsuit. So what happened in that lawsuit? If you're curious, here's a short little paragraph on that. A lawsuit brought by Aaron Hernandez's family against the NFL over CTE was dismissed by a federal judge in 2019 because he was considered a retired player under a class action settlement that excluded individual claims. The judge ruled the lawsuit involved relitigating issues already covered by the broader NFL concussion settlement, which also stipulated the individual compensation for suicides related to CTE was too late to be sought after Hernandez's 2017 death. So basically, it got thrown out. So you would think that's it, right? Well, I got one more shocking piece of information for you. And I'm going to take you to 2024, and we're going to talk quickly about Aaron Hernandez's brother, DJ. DJ was arrested in 2024 for threatening to shoot up the University of Connecticut. Now, he pleaded to those charges, and he pleaded guilty on December 18th of 2024. I'm going to reference a quick article by the Associated Press. Dennis Hernandez, the troubled brother of late New England Patriots tight end Aaron, pleaded guilty to threatening to carry out a shooting at the University of Connecticut and to kill 3 people outside of the state, including a judge, in 2023. Federal prosecutor said. Hernandez, 38, who went by DJ while playing football for UConn in the mid-2000s, appeared in federal court in Hartford and pled guilty to transmitting interstate communications containing a threat to injure, which carries up to 5 years in prison. Sentencing is set for February 6, 2025. His public defender did not immediately return an email. Terry Hernandez told police around the time of his arrest in Bristol last year that he had deteriorating mental health problems, including bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Dennis Hernandez was shocked with a stun gun and taken into custody after he came out of his sister's house with his arms raised, yelling, "Shoot me," and threatening to harm officers. Federal prosecutors said Hernandez threatening a shooting at UConn's main campus in July of 2023 while messaging another person on Facebook. Quote, "I will recommend remaining away from there because when I go, I'm taking down everything," Hernandez wrote. "And I don't give a fuck who gets caught in the crossfire. I've died for years now, and it's other people's turn. I'm prepared to give my life. Not all shootings are bad, and I'm realizing some are necessary for change to happen." Court filings said Hernandez was struggling financially, was frustrated at seeing other people get hired as football coaches, and felt owed by UConn. He played quarterback and wide receiver for the Huskies. Police said Hernandez had driven to the UConn campus and to Brown University in Rhode Island, where he once served as quarterback's coach, to map the schools out for a shooting. Also in July of 2023, prosecutors said Hernandez made multiple Facebook posts threatening to harm or kill 3 people who lived outside of Connecticut, including a state judge. Hernandez has pending charges in state court in Connecticut in connection with an incident outside ESPN headquarters in Bristol. He was arrested in March of 2023 on misdemeanor breach of the peace charges after police said he threw a bag containing a brick and a note over a fence and onto ESPN's property before leaving. It said, quote, "To all media outlets, it's about time you all realize the effects media has on family members. Since you're a worldwide leader, maybe you could lead how media and messages are delivered brick by brick. Clean it up. Yours truly, DJ Hernandez," the note said. Authorities said Hernandez was angry with people he believed were profiting from the death of his younger brother, Aaron Hernandez, who killed himself in 2017 while serving a death sentence. So what happened to him? Well, let's get to the sentencing. February 7th of 2025, the brother of late New England Patriots tight end Aaron Hernandez was sentenced Friday to 18 months of prison time, but he was served to time served, so he didn't really stay in prison any longer. Dennis Hernandez, 38, who went by DJ while playing quarterback at UConn, was suffering a severe mental health problem at the time of the threats and has since received treatment and medication, according to his public defender. Hernandez, who apologized for his action during brief comments in court, was expected to be released from custody later that afternoon. The Federal Bureau of Prison Records showed he was no longer in custody as of the evening of this article. State criminal charges in Connecticut and Florida in other cases, including allegations against ESPN, are expected to be dismissed because of the federal case, adding those incidents happened during the same mental health crisis. So there you have it. Look, this has been a long series. I wanted to give the rest of it to you today because I got some other shit I need to get into other than Aaron Hernandez, but I hope you enjoyed this Bad Boys series. Would love to hear your opinions. Comment. Y'all know I post this on the Facebook page, and I usually link each episode that I post. Comment in there and let me know what you think. Did CTE play a major role in this? Do you feel bad because of the CTE to the point that it kind of excuses the murder of Odin Lloyd? I'd love to know your opinion because there's a big gray area there. And I just want to know what y'all think, what my listeners think. Thank you so much for listening. I got some big shit coming up here on Exposed Scandalous Files of the Elite. I'll see you in a couple days when we drop our next episode. And until next time, for Exposed Scandalous Files of the Elite, I'm your host, Jim Chapman. Much love.